Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever RSPO North America Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue. My name is Cameron Plesh, and I'm the U.S. representative for the RSPO. While we wait a few minutes for everybody else, all the attendees to join us, please take a moment to answer the poll question you see on your screen. We'll share the results for the poll question as soon as we get started, but we're going to wait about one more minute for everybody to join us today. For those of you just joining us, again, welcome to the North America Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue in the second session on human rights. We're going to wait about one more minute for everybody to join here. Please answer the poll question that we have up, though, and we'll share those results shortly. All right, hello everyone. Welcome again to the first ever RSPO North America Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue and the second panel for today. My name is Cameron Plesh, and I am the U.S. representative for the RSPO. So thank you to everybody for answering the poll. This is going to help set the tone for a conversation, and we might be able to bring this up a little bit later and discuss it. And over the next 3 days, we'll be having a few more panels for this series of webinars, covering a wide range of topics, focusing specifically on North American stakeholders and how North American stakeholders can make an impact. But today for this session, I'm honored and excited to introduce the Human Rights from a Distance panel, talking about how North American stakeholders can make an impact on human rights. But before we begin today, a bit of housekeeping. All attendees are going to be in listen-only mode, with only the panelist and the moderator being visible and audible. However, we still really want to hear from all of you. So throughout the session, please type your questions into the questions box located in your menu bar, which will be on the right side of your screen. We'll try to ask as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we're going to try to get to as many as we can today. But please let us know if your questions are directed towards any of the individual panelists or if it's directed to the entire group. And again, although this conference was intended to be in person, for obvious reasons, we're all here remotely from around the world. So please bear with us if there are any technical challenges that we face during this. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dan Strechay, who is the Global Outreach and Engagement Director for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Dan has more than 18 years of experience in communications, public affairs, and stakeholder engagement with a focus on sustainability. And in addition to his current role and previous roles with the RSPO, he's held positions with organizations like PepsiCo, Asia Pulp and Paper, and Sims Metal Management, all of which were focusing on a wide range of challenges and issues in very complex global supply chains. So with that, Dan, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Cameron. I really appreciate it. As some of you know that are on the line, I used to be the U.S. representative for the RSPO. So being able to participate in our first Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue in North America is extremely exciting for me, and I think it's something that we've been working towards since probably 2014, 2015, when the Secretariat really started to get involved in this market. So it's great to see the transition from North America to go from 100 or so members to now the largest country by membership. And today we're joined by an extremely exciting group of panelists to talk about human rights from a distance, or what can we do from North America? From Oxfam, we have Irit Tamir. From Kellogg Company, we have Sarah Smith, sorry. And from Ulula, we have Vera Belazelkoska. Sorry about that. As a Strechay, I should do better on that. I'd love for you guys just to, and we'll start with you, Vera, to introduce yourselves, a little bit about your organization, and kind of talk about how you fit in with this panel and this discussion on human rights.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for this great gathering. So as you said, my name is Vera. My background's in political economy and international development, and I've been working on issues of stakeholder engagement and in different parts of the world, including Latin America, Asia, Central America, and Africa. And I direct programs at Ulula, so I oversee the design and implementation of different programs to use technology to better engage stakeholders to monitor human rights risks and impacts in global supply chains. We've worked on various industries, and from mining to agriculture and manufacturing. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today and bringing some of our learnings from collaborating with the RSPO since 2018.
Great. And Irit, could you tell us a little bit about your work with Oxfam?
Sure, happy to do that. So I direct our private sector team in Oxfam America. And for those who don't know about Oxfam, Oxfam is a rights-based organization working on development and eliminating poverty and inequality around the world. We work in over 90 countries around the world, including places where palm oil is one of the exports, places like Indonesia, for example. And we work on a whole host of issues that impact people's human rights and a whole host of sectors, including agriculture, but also mining and other sectors as well. Great.
And Sarah, I don't think we could have a North American panel with at least one downstream company represented. And
yes,
so could you tell us a
little
little bit?
Down for the end user, for sure. Yeah. So my name is Sarah. I'm on our global sustainability team, and I lead our work in human rights and deforestation. Been with the company for about 8 years, coming up through supply chain. And in case you're not familiar with Kellogg, we're a global consumer goods food company specializing in cereal and snack foods.
Great. Thank you for that. And you know, to the attendees, we have about 80 on the line right now, and we conducted a poll right at the start, and the results are encouraging. It says that about almost 80% of the organizations that are on the line have or are working to support human rights through partnerships, programs, or a human rights policy. And I think that's a great way to kind of kick this off and say to our panelists, and Vera, we'll start with you. Well, actually, Sarah, let's start with you. In North America, we're far away from a lot of these issues. Kellogg has a sprawling supply chain, some of which is domestic, but some of which is international. How can North American companies have an impact on human rights in the oil palm growing region?
So I think it's important to understand your position within the supply chain. For Kellogg, obviously we're end users, so we're quite a few tiers removed from what's going on the ground. But we do have ways that we can use our leverage to try and influence the human rights situation on the ground. One of those are through our sourcing decisions. So we control from whom and how much palm oil we buy from certain from suppliers. Partnership with those suppliers is a big one. So we definitely try to make sure that we're understanding where our tier 1 suppliers' perspective is coming from. We want to know a little bit more about their position within the supply chain and how we might be able to partner with them to influence activities on the ground. And I think one of the most important ones, which cannot be overstated, is multi-stakeholder initiatives. As a globally recognized brand, we have an opportunity to really be a force for good in some of those initiatives. While we might have a smaller footprint in palm oil than some of our peers, we have the opportunity to really further that leverage when we work in collaboration with other companies, particularly peers, stakeholders, smallholders, all up and down the supply chain.
Great. And Irit, your focus is a rights-based organization that's working in a lot of these countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, the largest producers. And you're helping to engage these companies here in North America. So what's Oxfam's perspective when you approach or when you talk to companies in North America about what their impact can be on human rights?
Yeah, so as Oxfam, we work with companies across the supply chain, and we particularly are trying to get them to work on issues around their policies and their practices as it relates to human rights, everything from living wage and living income to free, prior, and informed consent, to right to food issues, to sustainable land use planning, women's economic empowerment, independent smallholder inclusion, and human rights defenders, just to name some of the topics that we try to engage companies on. We also work with investors on getting them to engage companies around these issues as well, right? So ensuring that they're including these kinds of issues as they're engaging them on ESG criteria, and also to improve companies' human rights due diligence policies and the way they conduct human rights due diligence. And we believe that North American companies here need to recognize that they have an impact in oil palm growing regions, whether they know it or not, particularly through their own purchasing practices. So that's a lot of what we work on with companies. And the impact can either be positive or negative. And we work with companies to work obviously towards this positive impact that we want to see, including even collaborating with companies to some extent on innovative business models. So one of those models is something that we call the Fair Company Community Partnership, which is a program that we're working on in Indonesia with companies and all value chain actors involved in palm oil.
That's great, thank you. I really like the innovative business model piece, and I think that's something that we've seen a lot from the NGO sector in the last 10 years. Is really that evolution of from just combatant to collaboration and pushing the envelope and how you can support each other to achieve a positive goal. So that's great to hear. Speaking of innovative, Vera, you work for Ulula, and it's a particularly interesting piece of technology to measure worker share of votes. What is your interaction with North America? And you sit in North America, so what's your take when you approach these North American companies and you have these discussions with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable that North American companies who use palm that they therefore share in the responsibility when it comes to monitoring and mitigating human rights, because they're part of the supply chain. They're an active member of the industry. It's quite important for them to take that responsibility and engagement. And we have seen that a lot of the companies that we engage with, that they of course are thinking about innovative ways to get close to the ground and be able to get buy-in from their suppliers and their other partners further upstream, but also thinking about creative ways and innovative ways in which they can engage stakeholders that they don't normally hear from. And today more than ever, technology can really facilitate greater closeness between different entities. So that is what we set out to do with Ulula, to create accessible and multi-channel and multilingual tools, or a toolbox that can help amplify stakeholder voices from across the globe, to bring together closer the entities that are sitting in North America making decisions about sourcing, human rights due diligence, where to audit, how to prioritize impact and change, and then bringing them much closer to the stakeholders on the ground, which include host communities as well as workers. So through the use of innovation and technology, we're able to amplify those voices that are hard to reach and oftentimes not so engaged, so that their feedback can be incorporated into North American actors' decision making.
And speaking of tools, I think that's a good segue to the next question I was going to ask. I don't think we we have to acknowledge that the COVID situation has really, it's sort of scary from a human rights perspective. You know, certification relies on auditors going out to facilities, to going out to plantations. So how have you adapted? How does Ulula adapted, or has just business just exploded because of COVID? So how have you guys approached this situation? What's it look like for you?
Yeah, and prior to COVID as well, there was always room for innovation. You know, we don't pretend that traditional ways need to be completely scrapped, because we agree that you know, contact on the ground and engagement on the ground and observation is really important. Collaborating with local CSOs and NGOs is extremely important, and we don't pretend to replace that with technology. But even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, there are ways that we needed to rethink how to make stakeholder engagement more scalable and more accessible. And then this pandemic pushed us into it head first, and companies got very creative, and you know, we are just one tool that can support with that. But ultimately, the biggest risk was that we would see a bit of a retraction and maybe foregoing of best practices when it came to stakeholder engagement because of travel restrictions. So it really has pushed companies to think quickly and innovatively, and it really does. This pandemic also brings to light the importance of stakeholder engagement, because you know, to curb a pandemic, to inform communities about the risks, to get real-time insights about potential spread of infectious diseases or any other human rights related issue on the ground. It's important to have that open, honest, anonymous conversation. So this is where technology can come into play, and we have seen more conversations, more open, more urgent conversations since the pandemic has started, because companies know they have to think creatively about how they can receive information now that they cannot send CVs and auditors on the ground. And reviewing codes of conduct remotely is just not enough, because that does let go of that best practice of getting worker feedback. So we have to adapt to that, and we've seen companies doing so.
Great. And Irit, what kind of tools or resources or partnerships can companies look to if they want to become more engaged on this issue? And then again, what has changed in this pandemic situation for you guys?
Yeah, so just to, I think, echo what Vera is saying, I think stakeholder engagement is critical, right? And particularly, I think COVID-19 has highlighted this, because where companies already have relationships on the ground to rights holders, they then have that direct feedback that they can rely on to understand what's happening on the ground, right? They don't then have to rely on auditors to go into the field if they have partnerships with organizations that are already working with those rights holders. So I would say collaborating with CSOs on the ground, worker rights organizations, unions, farmer cooperatives are critical to understanding what's happening in real time to their rights holders. Oxfam has a number of tools that it has at our own disposal, but also for use by companies. One of those tools is something called the Community-Based Human Rights Impact Assessment Tool. And that tool is really a tool for communities to be able to use to understand human rights impacts that they're experiencing as a result of development projects. But the nice thing about that tool, speaking of technology, is it's online, it's interactive, and it's available for anybody. So companies can also use this tool. And one of its features is really to ensure engagement across all stakeholders, and it really walks the user through that engagement and really identifying who all your stakeholders are and how to engage them to understanding what's happening on the ground. And I think it's critical to understand what's happening on the ground from the community members themselves, right? And that's what that tool allows for. But due diligence overall and impact assessments overall, I think, are critical tools for companies to be using. We also have a number of tools that we encourage companies to use around women's economic empowerment. We know that women in particular are often excluded from a lot of these engagements, and so really critical to have that extra care when reaching out to women in particular.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, what does Kellogg use in terms of leveraging tools? What are you guys doing that's kind of innovative, or maybe it's not even innovative, maybe it's just a tool that really works for you guys?
So right now we use a variety of different tools, and I think one of the main things that I can say is that we always try to stay aligned to best practices. When you're looking at all of the different resources and partnerships that are out there, it can be a little bit overwhelming trying to understand what would be fit for purpose for my organization. So we try to be as innovative and creative as possible while still being realistic, understanding where our position is in the supply chain and what we can effectively leverage and use our voice to influence. So connecting mainly with our tier 1 stakeholders is a really big one. We want to make sure that we're really driving home those partnerships and keeping the dialogue open between their business and our business. We also look to civil society quite a bit to understand, and especially those that are on the ground and directly interfacing with stakeholders and rights holders. Getting that, like Irit said, getting that community voice is extremely important, and we want to make sure that the tools that we're using aren't just benefiting us, but they're actually hitting home and really trying to drive what we're trying to do pre-competitively, which is protect the environment and improve livelihoods and lives throughout the supply chain. So without those voices, then what we're doing can often might not be fit for purpose. So it's really important to take into account all of the different stakeholders and perspectives that we have at our fingertips. And then I think the other thing is not being afraid to fail or not being afraid to try the wrong tool. I think the only real way you can not succeed here is to not do anything. So we're usually open to what new things that are coming out, best practices. We really look to our peers to get that kind of information and feedback. Have they used a particular tool? What were some of the limitations that they found, or some of the barriers or roadblocks? And then incorporate that into our own decision-making process.
We have questions rolling in. I'm going to ask one more to the panelists, and then maybe we'll take a question from the audience. So audience members, attendees, please keep the questions coming in. I see some great ones coming in right now. I want to ask Irit, I want to ask you a question. What advice do you offer to other companies that are just starting out in this process, how they get involved? Obviously, taking into account that we're in a very different situation than we were probably 4 or 5 months ago. How would you go about, what would be your advice to them if they're just starting out?
Well, first of all, don't do it alone. Lots of other organizations can help you to identify the areas that you need to address and help to provide valuable information from previous experiences for you to build upon. Including, by the way, the RSPO, which has lots of tools and initiatives to help provide practical information, but also other organizations that are working on these issues, like the Core Coalition in Indonesia, the Dutch Initiative on Sustainable Trade, groups like my own, Oxfam, which are happy to work with companies to help support them in this in their assessments and in addressing human rights. These are obviously big issues, and no one person or organization can solve them alone. They're often systematic, and so we need to apply approaches that are systemic and address those systemic issues. So oftentimes, if you're going to address these issues, we're going to have to do them in some sort of multi-stakeholder fashion, with lots of organizations coming at them in order to address them. And I think COVID-19 just further highlights that, right? It shows that these issues are quite big and also systemic in nature. And so in order for us to tackle them, we need to come at them together.
Great. And Sarah, Kellogg is obviously pretty advanced in their journey, and not just for palm, but for other commodities as well. What would your advice be to someone, a small or medium enterprise or any organization just starting out this process?
Don't get overwhelmed. I think that's the biggest key that we found, is to segment the actions that we want to take and really make sure that we're being targeted in our action. One of the best things you can do, and I'll echo Irit here, is that you want to really work with your stakeholders, work with your peers, work with any of the partnerships that you have available, and then really figure out exactly what is it that you're trying to achieve. So once you have the what, then you can start working on the how, and figure out what's best for your business case and resource capabilities to be able to drive those collective goals to fruition. So I think it's really important to understand that we're all on the same journey, and that it's not necessarily a pass or fail. So it's really important to keep trying different things, making that business case at home for why you're doing the work that you're doing and why you want that to be a priority, and really making sure that the purpose is understood throughout internal stakeholders, and that you're aligning with the external stakeholders who are also working in this pre-competitive space.
That's great. I'm going to ask you a follow-up. I've worked for several organizations that were kind of in different places on their journeys towards sustainable sourcing or sustainable production. And how did one of the questions that came in from the audience is, how does Kellogg continue to try to meet these challenges? And there's new challenges that pop up, but how did you also mainstream the idea of sustainability into across the levels of your organization, so that when you're making a business decision, is sustainability something that's taken into account for procurement or for other functions?
Absolutely, and it takes time to embed sustainability throughout the organization. You're looking for cross-functional champions within each different area, I think, which can really help make that business case for why sustainability is important. Really being able to show the purpose and the value that it not only adds to the community and to the world in general, but being able to really articulate that business case. One of the biggest things I think that we've really learned to do internally is to speak the language of whatever function we're engaging with. So when we're talking to supply chain, we want to talk in supply chain terms. When we're talking to legal, we want to talk in legal terms. Using just the vernacular and the style of sustainability doesn't always get that personal touch that we're looking for. So really making sure that we're speaking in the business language to who our audience is extremely important.
Great. And Vera, what advice would you offer to either a company that comes to you, doesn't know what to do, be it in the oil palm sector or another sector? What's your advice to someone starting it out?
Yeah, I mirror some of the feedback and advice shared already. I would also flag that companies are at different points in their journey, so they should definitely not try to always mirror what someone else is doing, because they might be actually in a much more mature or just at the start of the journey. So it's important to do an assessment and see where it makes sense to begin. If you haven't yet traced your supply chain, maybe a worker voice and human rights monitoring solution like Ulula maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you first need to begin mapping and getting all the way further and further upstream until you know where that risk is, and then implementing a monitoring system. So it's important to do that assessment and be analytical and honest and open about that. And I think as it has been shared before, it's important to be honest about that process. It's everybody is working at this together. So prioritization comes once you understand where you are in the journey. And the second thing I would say is, once you identify things to work on, they might not be the same everywhere around the world. You might want to localize the solutions and interventions based on the local realities. And this is where local organizations can support. This is where best practices come in, because what you might need to set up in parts of Ghana with smallholders might be very different than industrial plantations in Sabah, Malaysia. So it's important to have that context front of mind. When we design programs in stakeholder engagement, we always spend a lot of time analyzing and discussing this context so that we can propose the best solution possible, because a blanket silver key is not going to work everywhere. And as Sarah mentioned, it also doesn't hurt to try and iterate, and this is what innovation is all about. You test something, you see how it goes, you start with a pilot, and then you decide what iterations need to be made to further adapt an engagement tool or any new process that you have decided to undertake, so that you can keep fine-tuning it and localizing it even further.
Great, thank you for that. That's a good lead-in, I think, when you talk about right-sizing the approach to the geography, to a question that came in from our attendees. And again, keep the questions coming in. I see them coming in, it's great. So the question is, for whoever wants to answer it, how do you define the boundaries of who is not included as a stakeholder? So if you're just beginning this journey, who are my stakeholders? How would you define that?
That's an interesting question. I think you're really looking for who has influence in your business, either externally or internally. And then also who your business affects. Those are going to be your stakeholders. So taking the time and looking to some of the external resources that are available. I think and I can't drive this home enough, multi-stakeholder initiatives are great for helping answer all of these questions. I know that I've personally been able to go and ask a peer company, someone who's working in a similar space, or, even someone from civil society. You can say, so who do I really need to be taking into consideration into my decision-making process? And the stakeholders here, we're working in a pretty competitive space, so everyone's going to have, quite a few of the same stakeholders. We're talking about rights holders, we're talking about consumers, civil society, peers, suppliers. These are all the ones that you need to take into consideration, and really sitting down and doing a mapping exercise of not only who has influence on your organization, but who your organization influences can be very beneficial in helping to target what kind of actions you need to take and move forward with.
Great. Anyone else want to take a shot at that one? All right. Here's a question for Irit and Vera that is interesting. At times we see, and let me just summarize, sometimes we see a disconnect between the social NGOs and the environmental NGOs, where conservation is sort of in isolation from the social aspect. I think a lot of us that work on issues see it a little bit more complex. How do we either find a way to get those missions to come together, or does the work have to be separate?
I think that's a really great question. And at least for Oxfam, we don't see these as separate issues. Oxfam is as concerned about the environment as we are about people, because at the end of the day, people need a healthy environment. So we do come at it from the people perspective, but we are just as concerned about issues related to the environment, including climate change, as the environmental groups. I think we need holistic approaches, right, that take all of these issues into account. And generally speaking, if it's good for people, it's going to be good for the planet, because at the end of the day, particularly those people that are in those affected communities, right, they're relying on the planet for their livelihood. They're actually relying on the environment for their livelihood, so they need it to be healthy. They need it to work with them, not against them. So I think when we're thinking about these things in a much more holistic way, we're able to address these issues. And I do think, and at least for Oxfam, I can say, we are in coalitions with environmental groups. When we make demands, particularly around issues related to palm oil, when we make demands to companies, we are consulting our environmental organization colleagues to ensure that we are aligning those asks together so that we aren't making different demands on companies. So we really are trying to bring those recommendations together between our organizations.
Yeah, and I can also add that when we think about human rights assessments or labor rights assessments that we design to deploy in the field, we also think about the environmental issues because as Irit mentioned, they're completely interlinked. So people's access to clean water is a human rights issue. People's access to clean air and to forests is a human rights issue. So I'll give an example from another industry. In the mining sector, when we run community engagement, community impact surveys, we don't separate them as a social and environmental, but rather we ask stakeholders about different impacts that are both have a human rights social element, but also an environmental element that is again connected to human rights. So in our mind, these are two things that are extremely integrated and interlinked. And I agree that in the initiatives and interventions, we oftentimes separate them. And I would also like to see a little bit more bridging and collaboration, and for us to think about these impacts, the environmental impacts as human rights issues that we bring forward on the table and tackle holistically.
That's great to hear. I think we have to mention the fact that we're going through a period here in the United States and now globally, recognizing the manner in which we've dealt with race, and that we have to have a much tougher conversation with ourselves and realize that there's a lot to address in our own nations. And I think one of the things that when you look at the oil palm sector, it's very far away. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So how do you encourage your organizations or funders or others to take this action when maybe more so in the past you could have just ignored it and hope it goes away? But are there inspiring stories or positive experiences that you can share? And maybe Sarah, I'll start with you, of where you were able to use the fact that even though you're a North American company and your supply chain's all the way over here, that you were able to use that positive impact that your organization had.
Yeah, I think there's a great value, and I think Irit and Vera had already mentioned this, but we do what we do because we love the work and because we're committed to making the world a better place, you know, environmentally and socially. That in and of itself is a reward, especially when you're working in a competitive atmosphere like, you know, global big business. It's often, it's rewarding to have that sort of altruistic angle to the work that we're doing. But I think that the biggest way that we get benefit and see inspiring stories are through that incremental change. We all know that the goal here is scalability and to transform an industry, but it's really those individual stories of communities, you know, of smallholder farmers, yield improvements, livelihood improvements. Those are the things that really kind of drive home the work that we're doing and why we're doing it, which makes it a little bit more personal and takes it out of that realm of too big to tackle almost, and really makes it something that a brand can really, you know, align their purpose behind and use what leverage we do have to make those kinds of changes. Those are the stories, those are the types of things that we really like to focus on and highlight in our work, you know, in the work of others.
Does it ever get tough to sell that? Do you lean on those when you're getting some of the negative attention? I worked for a very large CGM, and at times there were questions, why are we doing this if we're just going to get attacked? Is that when you leverage those stories?
Yeah, I think, well, no offense, but we're going to be challenged no matter what, right? So as long as there are issues on the ground, we're going to be, as a global business, as a globally recognized brand, we're going to be challenged on these issues. So it's not necessarily an if, it's more of a when. And then there's also a social contract, I think, just by virtue of being a global corporate citizen that we have with our consumers and with our stakeholders, which accepts a responsibility to the supply chain and to the work that we're doing to make sure that we're not causing adverse effects, you know, for human rights, for the environment. Just by virtue of existence, it's something that we need to really take into account to be globally operational. But again, I think that speaks to how do you speak internally in the language of your own brand and your own corporation, and really making sure that you're hitting on the right points when you're making that business case. There are a lot of different elements out there from all kinds of stakeholders, all kinds of resources that'll make a variety of different business cases for you. So being able to bring that home, internalize it, and really speak in the language of your own company is where you start to see those gains being made and those attitudes starting to flip.
Great. Vera, do you want to add something to that? Do you have examples of where you've used those types of stories to kind of push an organization, maybe a client of yours?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we try to empower champions within companies with data, because financial teams have data and forecasts to make decisions. So why shouldn't sustainability and responsible sourcing teams? So we use the power of worker community feedback to provide analytics so that these champions within companies could push the needle internally. So that is one way to do it. And I'll share one really positive example, and it's nowhere near done because it takes a lot of work, but in the spirit of multi-stakeholder approaches, which we've all mentioned during this call, we are currently working in a quite a complex project where we have every player, upstream and downstream, involved in the program. So we're working with consumer goods brand Pepsi, we're working with the processor and traders, Cargill, we're working with producers in 3 different countries, as well as a nonprofit, international and local CSOs, with our partner Proforest and the RSPO as an entity. So with all of these players, it's difficult to to build a program and coalesce around the ideas and what are the priorities and how should we engage stakeholders, what kind of data do we collect, how frequently, what matters most, how to standardize data collection across such diverse regions, and at the same time making the program relevant. But it's also one of the most rewarding experiences, because we've never had a project in any other sector where we have discussed these issues from the local community relations and local worker well-being teams, together with RSPO, together with the processors and traders and consumer buyer. It's been an extremely positive experience, and I think it's bound to lead to more positive outcomes because we have so much buy-in across the entire supply chain. And I think it is an act within that spirit of shared responsibility, which I know was an RSPO a theme for last year. And I think it does speak to different actors' desire to begin to open up and discuss how to best make progress and cross the aisle, so to speak, for this shared cause of really finding out what the priorities are and how to best tackle them.
Great, thank you for that. And Irit, how about yourself? Do you have those as well, those types of examples?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we're starting to see a lot of positive things happening in the human rights space. We've seen banks and companies pay reparations for human rights violations in places like Cambodia, which models for others what good and responsibility looks like. We've also seen many companies implementing human rights policies, which is important, as I see us at a tipping point right now. And we see that also in terms of legislation, right? So we're approaching 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and we've seen really this upswell in terms of regulation popping up now around human rights due diligence. You know, it started with things like the California Transparency Act and the UK Modern Slavery Act, but now we have the French duty of vigilance law, and we are now looking at EU mandatory human rights due diligence. So, you know, these are the things that are exciting me about where we're making progress, because as those pieces of legislation move forward, we'll start to see a more even playing field for how companies have to deal with these issues.
Yeah, I think that point can't be underestimated about the financial firms becoming more involved, and the certain pieces of legislation around the world or regulation that are asking companies to take a harder look at their supply chain if they're not already. And I think that's a really good segue into one of our audience questions that I'd like to ask. They said, you know, I think it was 17 or 7% of organizations said that their companies don't have or not working on a human rights policy. If you're internal and you're in this organization, how do you go about encouraging your organization or to enact a human rights policy, or to start this journey? And maybe, Irit, I'll start with you, and then Sarah, maybe you can give your perspective, and Vera, you can add on.
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of a number of things that they can do. One is arm yourself with data, right? Show your company where these risks exist. You can also show them where they compare with peers by using all sorts of benchmarks that are out there. The corporate human rights benchmark. I mean, there's, you know, benchmarks galore for them to compare themselves to. You can ask an organization to campaign on you. Nothing will raise the issue to the top of the food chain in your company more than a campaign, right? We have had companies ask us to campaign on them from the sustainability teams. So I say that tongue in cheek, but not really, because we've actually had companies come to us and ask us to do that. And that can oftentimes get leadership's attention.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight both the positive and the negative aspects. At Kellogg, we had an older ad that ran, which was a picture of a cornflake with the tagline, "A reputation is a fragile thing." In today's environment, it is so easy to be a target for something, and information spreads like wildfire right now. So one of the things that you can highlight within your own organization is not always what the benefits of action are, but some of the dangers of inaction. One of the things that we found is that when we're transparent, when we're open about our reporting, civil society, NGOs, stakeholders are more willing to work with us rather than against us. We want to make sure that we're really highlighting those partnerships, and then we want to bring it back to a brand focus too, on also why this does benefit our brand. Benefits the reputation, it enhances your trustworthiness with consumers. Things like ESG investing, which we mentioned, God, the benchmarks, there's plenty of benchmarks to use. So scorecards, all of these things can help make the business case to show, you know, this isn't something that's a nice to have anymore. This is a must have. This is a social license to operate in today's environment. So really making sure that that information continues to be hit home. And I'd say, and don't just stop with one method. Try some different angles if that's what it takes to really get that message across. Continue to partner with peers and other organizations that have gone through similar challenges and see what worked for them.
Great. And Vera, how would you encourage your organization, or maybe you're talking to someone who wants to take the step to use your technology or to work on these issues?
Yeah, I'll mirror a lot of what's said already, and the one point about legislation is a really important one. I mean, I know here in Canada, the government has been exploring and looking into and assessing what kind of legislation it might want to enact, from volunteer reporting to mandatory human rights due diligence. So it's important to, it's no longer an option. I think companies need to get ahead. So that is what we share, that sooner or later they're going to be asked to report on these issues and showcase what they're doing. So might as well get ahead. And then we also are seeing some shifts in other types of legal frameworks and trade frameworks. I mean, just last year there was enough momentum on cocoa imports into the United States from places where there's clear evidence that it's being produced by child labor. So blocking of imports is a really big stick. So we normally work with our clients talking more about the carrot and how can you get ahead so that it doesn't come to that, and how can you as a company showcase that you're doing all that's in your power to monitor these risks and working with your local partners to drive that positive outcome.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up here. We're a little over time. I apologize for that, but I could talk about this all day. In my mind, we don't talk about it enough. So Vera, I'm going to ask you for a quick 30-second takeaway for the attendees. You know, what's your call to action? What should the audience do after this? What should they take away from this panel?
I mean, I'll say that, and there's never been a better time to provide more evidence for what I'm about to share, which is that, you know, supply chains are only as resilient as their workforce. And I think we've seen that in supply chain of medical equipment, personal protective equipment, you know, food supply chains. We're seeing massive impacts on the meat industry because of COVID spread in factories that haven't been properly transitioned to safer working environments. So I think I will leave the audience with that the workforce is a priority, even if they're not your direct workforce. As a company, try to find ways to hear from them, because your supply chain will be only as resilient as the well-being of those workers.
Sarah, what is your takeaway for our attendees today?
Don't go it alone. There's so many options, there's so many resources out there, and we're all working toward, luckily when you're working in pre-competitive spaces like this, we're all working towards the same goals, protecting the environment and enhancing the livelihoods of the workers and the people in our supply chain. So I would say make sure you stay close to those multi-stakeholder initiatives, stay close to your peers, stay close to your suppliers, keep that dialogue open and the information and transparency coming, because that's really how we start to make that scalable change. I think we found quite well in the evidence of, you know, the lead up to 2020 that individual efforts can only go so far. So it's really up to collaborative and aligned efforts that we're going to start making those step changes that we really want to see within the industry.
Great. Irit, and what would your call to action be?
I think one thing we underestimate is that human rights violations are often a result of power imbalances, and North American companies have a whole lot of power when it comes to these supply chains. And people within these companies, you all have the ability to really empower people in supply chains, and so do that. Use your power to help have a positive impact on these affected communities. You actually can do that in your supply chains. Don't do it alone. I agree. Do it with others, including those workers and farmers that want to work with you.
Great. So I think those are all great takeaways. The fact that we have to recognize our extremely important position in this world as a business community here in North America. Don't go it alone. You know, recognize that importance. Work with your peers. Stay close to your peers and your suppliers. And that your supply chain is only as resilient as its workforce, which I think it can't be understated as we panic bought toilet paper across North America and the world. With that, I want to thank Cameron Plesh, our U.S. representative for the RSPO, and I want to thank Vera, Irit, and Sarah for joining this call. This has been really engaging for me, and I've enjoyed it. I hope the attendees have enjoyed it as well. Cameron?
Yeah. Again, yeah, thank you, Dan, Irit, Sarah, and Vera. As Dan said, I could do this all day, so it's sad that we had to cut these short, but thank you all for joining us. This is really incredible. And again, for everybody else, if you have not registered for the other panels, we do still have 2 more days coming up. You can find it on the RSPO website in the events section. All of these panels will be recorded, so we will share them with all of you later. But again, the next sessions start tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. First one will discuss downstream actors and how they can affect deforestation and through their policies and implementation. And the second session will discuss the impact of banks and investors. So some really good ones tomorrow as well. But thank you for joining this one. This is a really great session. Again, thank you all of you for being panelists and moderators, and thank all of you the attendees for joining our dialogue today. And we'll hopefully see you tomorrow. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.